Hi guys, welcome to Twin Perspective. I'm Joe, and tonight I'm going to be breaking down the best albums of Genesis. Now, my brother and I cover Twin Peaks, and we also cover movies. We love entertainment, and music's a big part of it too. So the only video we've done so far, I did one on artists and albums, and I broke down my favorite 16 artists. And of course, that list fluctuates depending on my mood, but I've put it down, and that's what I'm going to stand by right now until, another album comes out and tickles my fancy and makes me change these ratings. Well, that was the only one I ever did on music, and spoiler alert, my favorite band of all time is Genesis. Now, I wanted to do a video breaking down what I thought were their best albums, because Genesis doesn't get a lot of love out there. I think that Genesis has existed in some form, in some incarnation, where just about anybody who likes music can appreciate it. At some point throughout the career of Genesis, I'm sure they released something that everybody liked, at least one song. But they were around for 30 years, and genres change, and bands evolve and change, especially when the members come and go. So Genesis at first was regarded in the 70s as a progressive rock band, and I think most music appreciators can recognize Genesis was one of the best progressive rock bands of the 70s. But most of the time, people will pick somebody else, like, something similar to Genesis, like either Rush or Styx or Marillion eventually. There'll always be somebody out there who likes Yes better than Genesis. And I think one of the biggest complaints about Genesis for the fans, the real fans, is that there were so many incarnations where Peter Gabriel was the lead singer and one of the primary songwriting forces for years throughout the 70s. And then when he left, the influence of Gabriel left. It was still there amongst the members, but all of them wrote songs and they all contributed to the writing, and it was just a faction of Genesis that wasn't there writing anymore. So, eventually in the late 70s, Phil Collins took over as the singer, and I think most fans forgave it because he was in the band and he did a lot of singing on all the albums, backup for sure, and just about everything. So there was some forgiveness, and Phil could handle it. But Phil's writing style and Phil's inspirations were probably more along the lines of a softer, maybe more jazzy. They were all influenced by jazz. They were all influenced by Motown, but they just went about it in a different way. Now, what I'm trying to say is, when the band first started, you had Peter Gabriel and Tony Banks and Michael Rutherford and Anthony Phillips. Now, these four guys loved Motown and loved jazz and blues and stuff like that, but they all had a desire to do something different with the music, and how they chose to express that difference, in my opinion, was to write with chords that bands typically don't use, and to create chord progressions that don't sound like anything that's out there. So when they first started, the first album was full of nothing but single length songs, 4 minutes long, 4.5 minutes long, and emulated kind of like Bee Gees or not the surfy Beach Boys or Beatles kind of. But the second album, they were definitely trying to write progressive rock, where they were trying to write these long songs with different parts in them, almost sounding like 3 or 4 different songs crammed into one 7-8 minute song. There was an effort there by these 4 individuals to push the music in that direction. Eventually, Anthony Phillips left the band as the guitar player, and they picked up Steve Hackett. And Steve Hackett was also a guy who wanted to express himself that way by doing something different, making it sound different, different chords, changing things up. But Phil Collins came along as a drummer, and although he was talented enough to keep up with all of this theatrics, I think deep down inside, Phil was always a simple, lovey-dovey, sappy, let's get a couple of good chords, write a pretty song with a pretty melody, and that was Phil's way of expressing himself. So, long story, even longer, Peter leaves the band, then eventually Steve Hackett leaves the band. You get down to just the 3, Michael Rutherford, Tony Banks, and Phil Collins, and there starts to be more of a turn towards simpler songs, because Phil Collins is now a third of the songwriting force instead of a fifth, or a fourth. So, and things change, when drum machines became prevalent, they were able to hold back. Before, it was the keyboards trying to keep up with the complicated bass line that was trying to keep up with the complicated drums, and that was your rhythm. And now with a drum machine playing, you can, like Phil said, lay back, hold one note for a while, let it hang around for a while. And besides, the collection of music Genesis had in the 70s is so complicated and really miraculous that you're going to do that the rest of your life. I mean, so there you go. If you're a Genesis fan and you're a fan of progressive rock, you probably don't like Phil Collins and that side of it. If you are a fan of Genesis and you like more of a pop rock, then you probably wouldn't be attracted to what they did in the 70s with Gabriel. But most Genesis fans, I think, can find that little aspect of Genesis that makes them different, and you can find that in all of the different incarnations. I just think that instead of saying that Genesis sold out, I'm going to say that they existed for 30 years through 3 different decades that really had a difference in the way music was in general. And I think instead of calling it selling out, it's more like, okay, here's what the new generation has in store. Here's the new sounds. Here's the new style, the new production types, new toys to play with. And of course, all that lends itself to the sound of a particular decade, where I think Genesis probably could have defined all 3 of the decades with their originality and their talent. Okay, so 8 minutes in, without further ado, these are my favorite albums by Genesis, and it's a combination of what I think are the best albums combined with my favorites and combined with the significance. I think that it all comes together here. There are different times in my life when I would have picked a different favorite album, but here we are, 2018, and this is how I feel about it right now. Genesis will probably never do another album again, so this will probably stay this way. Okay, they had 15 major studio albums. I'm not including live albums or compilations or B-side collections or anything like that. These are just the 15 major albums. And at number 15, and this should be the worst album in any Genesis fan's mind, because if it isn't, then I don't know what to say about it. Calling All Stations. Number 15 is Calling All Stations from 1997. Otherwise known as And Then There Were Two. And if you're a Genesis fan, you know what I'm talking about. And Then There Were Two. Michael Rutherford and Tony Banks were the only founding members of Genesis left, or long-time members of Genesis left in the band. They got another lead singer. They threw together some songs. This was basically an album of Michael Rutherford and Tony Banks songs. Yes, strong members of Genesis, but without Peter Gabriel, without Phil Collins, you don't have a Genesis that, I'm going to want to listen to. So Calling All Stations had about, I'd say, 0 songs that I really liked. I can do without all of them. Ray Wilson's a great singer. The songs are really good. They're my favorite band of all time. But I have to discard this album, and it has to be last on anybody's list. And if it isn't, I don't know, you're kidding yourself. Okay. Next on my opinionated list, best albums by Genesis. At number 14, From Genesis to Revelation. This was 1969. This was the first album Genesis had. A ton of songs on it. They got an old guy from school, their school. They were, 17, 18 years old. Decided to throw an album together, throw a few tracks together. This guy produced it, added some goofy little horns and stuff to it, and released it. From Genesis to Revelation. Problem is, it didn't highlight the name of the band, Genesis, so people saw the title From Genesis to Revelation and they thought it was religious, so not very many people listened to it. And I'm sure the people that were religious that bought it returned it immediately. A lot of 4-minute songs on this album, a lot of great songs, but they appeared to be arranged as each individual singles, trying to appeal to a mass audience. There were some style to it. If they would have continued in that direction, I believe they would have still achieved success. There was a difference to what they were doing. It wasn't typical. I was comparing it to the Bee Gees, not the disco Bee Gees, but the other kind of arty, folksy Bee Gees, and same thing with the Beach Boys. Those are iconic bands. So for me to compare Genesis to them, obviously they weren't writing simple music. It was as simple as it got for Genesis, that album. But it was fun. And what really made the album stand out was, the keyboards from Tony Banks and the lyrics from Peter Gabriel. They were really poetic, really deep and different. So there was an effort there, but I put it second to last on my list because it was their original effort and not reminiscent of anything, as Calling All Stations as well, not reminiscent of anything that you identify with when you think of Genesis. From Genesis to Revelation, there's a few songs I like. In the Beginning, Fireside Song, The Conqueror, Window, and Silent Sun. Those are my favorites, my favorite tracks from this album. I think my all-time favorite from that album is probably Fireside Song. I'm a sap, so get ready for it. And before I go on my list, I have to explain. I was born in 1971, but really the first Genesis song I ever gravitated to was Follow You, Follow Me. I probably heard it on the radio sometime in the very late 70s or early 80s. I remember calling the radio station trying to figure out who sung the song, but I wasn't quite sure what the name of the song was, and because it was a few years after it had been released, the DJ wasn't sure what I was talking about either. Eventually, after my patience paid off, they played the song again. I was able to record it on a tape, and then I had Follow You, Follow Me in my life. I'm sure I'd heard other Genesis songs on the radio up to that point, but that was the first one I just had to have that I wanted to listen to over and over again. I have to admit, it's a pretty it's a pretty sappy song. I'm a sucker for melody. I'm a sucker for love songs. So And then, from that point on in my life, Phil Collins' Genesis was what defined Genesis for me. And I knew that Genesis was different than Phil Collins. There was a difference. I used to get aggravated when Genesis would come on and people would say that's Phil Collins. And as young as I was, I knew that there was a difference. No, that's Genesis. It's a totally different thing. Now, I hadn't gone back and listened to the Peter Gabriel Genesis, so I would have understood that, yes, it's very similar to Phil Collins compared to what they used to do, but it was always a major difference. And I always liked Genesis more. So, having said that, you can understand why I have a love for Phil Collins and a love for Genesis. I also love Peter Gabriel as a songwriter, and of course, he's in my top 5 too, all time. Phil Collins is, so is Genesis, so is Peter Gabriel. As solo artists, they do it for me. And I'm just a sucker for Phil. I'm a sucker for the sap. So there, you've been warned. Okay. Next on my list, 15 best Genesis from worst to first. At number 13, Wind and Wuthering from 1976. Probably kind of surprising. A lot of diehard Genesis fans really love this album. There is an effort, an artistic, progressive rock effort here with a lot of the tracks. Wind and Wuthering to me sounds like an album written by Steve Hackett and Tony Banks, pretty much. That's what it sounds like to me. The beginning and most of the songs in the beginning are the ones that the fans love, and I'm just not a fan of those songs. Now, there are a few from Wind and Wuthering that I really love, but they're the sappiest ones, and I hate to say it, but it's the truth. Your Own Special Way, What Gorilla, and Afterglow. And everything else on that album is just okay to me, so it's probably my favorite lineup. I wish Gabriel would have always stayed with the band, but I love that Steve Hackett was there for a little while, and this is a good album. It's just not one of my favorites. Although Afterglow is one of my all-time favorite Genesis songs. It's in my top 5 favorite Genesis songs. I have a list of favorite Genesis songs. I'll probably be doing a video of that too. This is for Genesis fans only, I guess, but I'm a huge fan, so there's not a lot of videos out there talking about Genesis. I saw a couple that broke down their opinions of the best albums, and that's what promoted me to do this, because I was like, really? Okay, well, this is what I think. And what I think is at number 12, And Then There Were Three from 1978. Steve Hackett left the band shortly after the 2 albums from 76. And this was the next album with just Phil Collins, Tony Banks, and Michael Rutherford. The first of their trio albums, and they developed a style eventually that was pretty damn good. This first outing, there was a mix there, a little progressive rock, a little more of a heavier rock, 70s kind of rock, and I don't think that they had figured out how they wanted to do things. It was a lot of just 1 or 2 of them writing together, and not the whole band coming together and doing something. I think that we saw more of that later on in their career. And still in all, And Then There Were Three, still a fun album for me. I like Down and Out. I like Many Too Many. I love The Lady Lies. And of course, Follow You, Follow Me. The sales of that album were really good because of Follow You, Follow Me, the love song sensitivity. It was get more women buying the records and interested in them. If you let Phil do some love song singing. Still, it's down the list. At number 11, this might be a shocker. We Can't Dance. Now, how could I say We Can't Dance is better than all those other albums I mentioned? I mean, how can We Can't Dance be better than, and then there were three? You know, or Wind and Wuthering, for goodness sake. This is when real Genesis fans are just pissed off at me right now. The real problem with We Can't Dance from 1991 is that I like every damn song. And it's not produced as well as a lot of them have been. There is a embrace of the pop rock of them at this point, but they do just enough of that take-off Genesis style where they break off, like in the Driving the Last Spike, you know, Fading Lights, even the ending of Living Forever, where they just go off on this Genesis rant, and I'm reminded then that this band still has it. I love every song on that album. No Son of Mine, Jesus He Knows Me, Driving the Last Spike, I Can't Dance, Dreaming While You Sleep, Living Forever, Hold On My Heart, Since I Lost You, and Fading Lights. I love the whole thing. It might not be the first Genesis album that I put on and want to listen to from beginning to end, but it's definitely not the last. I will put that one on before the others mentioned. And I'll sing every song and know every damn word. Like I said, I love Driving the Last Spike and Fading Lights. I think those are the two best. And even though that's the last album Phil did with them, and it was a big success, top 10 all over the world. Most people probably think We Can't Dance and Invisible Touch from '86, that those albums shouldn't be included high on a list because they're so pop rock compared to the prog rock they started doing in their career. But that's the way it is. That's how I feel. I'm a sap. I did it that way. Hope you can forgive me, and I hope you keep watching. At number 10, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. This is the epic album, the one story told through every song, this double LP. It's really 4 albums. The last album with Peter Gabriel. Critically acclaimed, not really successful. My favorite songs from this album are The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, In the Cage, Counting Out Time, and The Carpet Crawlers. There are a lot of great songs on this album. Songs that people love, Genesis fans love. And I appreciate the effort of wanting to make the epic wall the wall, you know. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. It's one of those things where the entire album is focused on one story, and the songs are very different in it. So it kind of loses consistency for me on that level. And, the story's kind of all over the place. I love it, though. I love the songs, and I just don't think that this was the best Gabriel Genesis effort. This seemed like more of a pet project for Gabriel, and then the rest of after he left the band, what he had started his career with solo-wise was some of my least favorite stuff he did. He evolved into a better musician, in my opinion. I bet a lot of people think he sold out too. He's just doing different things. But Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is not one of my favorites. It's good though. It's at number 10. At number 9, from 1970, Trespass. This was the second album Genesis did after that first album of 4-minute singles that sounded like radio music. This was the album that four-piece, and they picked up a studio drummer to do this album. That four-piece became a progressive rock band, something that needed to be on stage to perform these songs, so you can have the full effect of it. Most people that listen to basic radio music won't listen to this progressive stuff. It's too complicated. It goes all over the place, and they don't want to deal with it. But I think that when Genesis went from that first album to this album, Trespass, I think this is when they showed that they were an exceptional band, willing to do things that not a lot of bands can do. And Genesis was able to do it really well. On Trespass, there's only 6 songs. Looking for Someone is the first one. I like that one. And then I really love the last 3, Stagnation, Dusk, and The Knife. I find that a lot of Genesis fans don't like Dusk all that much, and I think Dusk is one of their best songs. And of course, The Knife is widely regarded as one of the best songs they've ever done. My favorite song on the album is actually Stagnation. I think that was one of the best achievements they've done as far as songwriting goes. And I love Trespass. So why on earth would I put this pop mofo ahead of it? At number 8, probably the most successful album of the band's career, Invisible Touch, 1986. Or 7. I think it was 1986. Pretty sure it was 1986. Every single they released from this album was a top 10 hit, pretty much. My favorites are Invisible Touch, Tonight, 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 Land of Confusion, In Too Deep, Anything She Does, Domino, The Last Domino, and The Brazilian. Oh, wait a minute. That's the entire album. Yes, it is. It's the entire album. All 8 tracks. Love them. They're condensed for radio, most of them. Tonight, Tonight, Tonight. The album version's brilliant. It's 8.5 minutes. They condensed that thing down to 4.5 minutes. So when it was on the radio most of the time. The video, actually, was a lot longer than the single. But Tonight, 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 in its album entirety, is a pretty damn awesome song. And I think they actually wrote it and recorded it in one day, which makes it even better. Land of Confusion, hey, revolution, baby, come on. But everyone's favorite classic Genesis fans, their favorites are Domino, The Last Domino, and The Brazilian. They still showed that they could do it. Now, the Domino and The Last Domino, as poppy as it is, aspects of it, that's still progressive rock to me on a impressive scale. And, people love The Brazilian, the instrumental, The Brazilian. I love it, too. It's great. All right, we're going to number 7. Can't believe Invisible Touch managed to pop up on the list as high as it did. Let's see what other Phil Collins treats we have. At number 7, Duke from 1980. 1980 was the same year Phil Collins released his first solo album, Face Value, which had the mammoth hit In the Air Tonight. And as soon as that single came out, people viewed Genesis differently from then on out. People fell in love with Phil Collins and In the Air Tonight. And when Genesis came out with something, they all paid attention. Like I said, most of them thought it was Phil Collins. Duke is probably the album that began the transformation and aspects of it, the eventual, or what would be, the trio of Anthony Banks and Michael Rutherford and Philip Collins. They still had a lot of different 70s kind of style with Duke, parts of it, but there was a huge change in the production and big drums, and a lot of what would sound like something Phil Collins would do on an album of his. But I think it was a pretty good collection, a pretty good combination. For Duke, I really love Behind the Lines, Duchess, Guide Vocal, Man of Our Times, Misunderstanding was a big hit, Turn It On Again, Alone Tonight, Duke's Travels, and Duke's End. That's almost the whole album. There's a few other tracks on there. A couple of them people really love, but those were my favorites from Duke. It's at number 7. At number 6. Yeah, Abacab, 1981. Abacab is a damn good album. Abacab was, yes, this is what Genesis is now, and they are pretty damn good. My favorite songs on that album: Abacab, No Reply at All, Me and Sarah Jane, Keep It Dark, Dodo, Lurker, and Man on the Corner. I probably have played that album more than any other Genesis album in my life, because, you know, I was a fan by the time Abacab came out. You know, like I said, I heard Follow You, Follow Me after the fact, and then became invested in the band. So started getting all the albums, along with Phil Collins' solo albums. And I was a big fan. And I think that Abacab is a brilliant album. It's hard for me to imagine somebody listening to Abacab and not thinking it's great. Seriously. I mean, you got to really hate Phil Collins to diss on Abacab. But Abacab to me is a beautiful creation of 3 musicians writing stuff together and having it come out pretty damn awesome. Now, I struggled with whether I liked Abacab from 1981 or the Genesis self-titled album 2 years later in 1983. Some people call the Mama album. I think that Abacab and the Mama album are neck and neck, but I gave the edge to the Mama album at number 5, Genesis, 1983. Songs that I love off this album include Mama, That's All, Home by the Sea, Second Home by the Sea, Taking It All Too Hard, Just a Job to Do, Silver Rainbow, and It's Gonna Get Better. This is a Phil Collins Genesis album, and I've ranked it all the way at number 5. It's one of those things that, just like Abacab, from the moment it was released, I put it in and played it constantly over and over again. It's probably my second most listened to Genesis album. And then Invisible Touch, 3 years later, I've listened to that one, ran it in the ground too. Self-titled Mama album is great. The production was not as good as Abacab, but it was still better than Invisible Touch and We Can't Dance. I think the same producer produced all of them. It was just the translation, and it was still pretty good. The self-titled Genesis. Home by the Sea and Second Home by the Sea is one of my favorites that they've ever done. I think that the old prog rock Genesis could have been proud of writing that song. And that self-titled Genesis album is the highest ranking trio album, the incarnation of Genesis that was a trio. So that means the rest of them are either Peter Gabriel or Steve Hackett. So at number 4, Foxtrot from 1972. The song, I think, only has 7 tracks on it. Watcher of the Skies, Get 'Em Out by Friday, Can Utility and the Coastliners, and Horizons, and Supper's Ready. Supper's Ready is considered by a lot of Genesis fans to be the best song Genesis ever did because it's a 23-minute epic where The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway was an entire album devoted to one story. This was a 20-something minute song full of different parts that was devoted to one story, sort of. And I think that's why people gravitate to Supper's Ready as the best Genesis song, because it is so epic. It's kind of like with Pink Floyd, The Wall was the concept album, and Echoes was the 20-something minute, long song. So Supper's Ready was the longest song Genesis ever did, and it's a classic to this day. There's only one segment in it toward the end that I'm not a huge fan of. But other than that, I could listen to that song forever. And it takes up, I think, the second half of the album for Foxtrot. The Watcher of the Skies and Can Utility and the Coastliners. I love those two songs. They're great. And I put Foxtrot up there. It's hard to do wrong with an album that's only got 6-7 songs on it. And they're all, these progressive rock epic efforts. At number 3, best Genesis album ever, Nursery Crime, from the year of my birth, 1971. The first album featuring Steve Hackett on guitar and Phil Collins on drums, and Phil Collins singing background, even though he did sing for Absent Friends. That's really good. You join a band and they let you sing a song all by your lonesome. Phil's got talent. You have to keep up with the changes in these songs. Nursery Crime, I've always had a soft place in my heart for Nursery Crime because it features the musical box, the opening song of the album, which is my favorite Genesis song of all time. So that one's number 1, spoiler alert, if I ever do it. Top 20, 25 Genesis songs. The musical box is my favorite. Also off that album, I like For Absent Friends, because Phil sings it. The Return of the Giant Hogweed. Harold the Barrel, that's fun. And The Fountain of Silences, which I have a love-hate relationship with, but ultimately, it's an 8.5-minute Genesis classic, and if I see them in concert, I assume that's one they may play. They'll definitely play the musical box. I wish they would tour. I wish that the whole band would get back together, Peter Gabriel, Phil, and just do one more tour. Phil can let somebody else play the drums. He can just sing. I'd love to hear Phil sing the Peter Gabriel songs. I'd love to hear Peter Gabriel sing some of the later songs that Genesis wrote. That would be fun. Peter Gabriel singing Home by the Sea would be great. At number 2, process of elimination, you guys should know what's left, and this is the highest ranking Phil Collins as lead singer album. At number 2, A Trick of the Tail, from 1976. The first album after Peter Gabriel left the band, A Trick of the Tail. It's a phenomenal album, classic album. I believe my brother doesn't feel the same way about this album that I do. But I think from beginning to end, it doesn't really have a bad part, except, I'm not a huge fan of Madman Moon. But other than that, I appreciate it. But other than that, a phenomenal album. Dancing on a Volcano, Squonk, Entangled, Ripples, A Trick of the Tail, and Los Endos. And Los Endos is one of the best Genesis songs ever, of course. Other people really love Entangled. I was a huge fan of Ripples for a long time. I mean, that's got some Phil Collins sap in it, and then you break off into this crazy arty Genesis breakdown, and then come back to the sappy Phil, Yeah, Ripples was a prologue of things to come. And if you watch my Artisan Albums video, you know that my all-time favorite Genesis album at number 1 is Selling England by the Pound, 1973. Fish thinks this is Genesis' best album too, but I've seen a couple of lists of Genesis albums ranked, and Selling England by the Pound was the number 1 album on all of them. So at least they got that right, in my opinion. Peter Gabriel, Steve Hackett, Phil Collins, Tony Banks, Michael Rutherford. This album only has one song on it that I don't like, and it's the epic, really long, and weirdly timed The Battle of Epping Forest. You know, it's got that 7/8 count, and it's just, you know, sometimes I'm in the mood and sometimes I'm not. In Genesis, they do some funky timing, but usually it doesn't consume the whole song. But other than that, I love Dancing with the Moonlit Night, I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, Firth of Fifth, More Fool Me, another Phil Collins song, After the Ordeal, which is one of the best songs they've ever done, and nobody talks about that song, and The Cinema Show and Isle of Plenty, The Cinema Show being one of the best songs they've ever done. This is a great album, Selling England by the Pound. Now, if you are scared of venturing into Genesis and the artsy-fartsy stuff, I would suggest getting Selling England by the Pound. Like I said, it's widely considered their best album, so ease into it slowly. If not, you know, if you're more of a Phil Collins fan, you probably already heard every song off of Invisible Touch. I would suggest the self-titled album or Abacab, but, you know, there's a difference there. So the further back you go, the more complicated it gets. And it's really hard for me to judge how to compare, you know, a Peter Gabriel-led 70s Genesis album to a mid-80s Phil Collins-led pop rock Genesis album. But that was my effort. They're my favorite band, and that's my 2 cents. Hope you guys liked it. I hope that this video is found by Genesis fans and they enjoy this breakdown. And if you're just a typical Rosenfield 10 subscriber, that's how I feel about Genesis. Take it for what you want. If you're interested, go out and get them the way I set them. That's it. Thanks for watching. This has been the best albums of Genesis. I'm Joe. This has been Twin Perspective. Please subscribe to Rosenfield 10 for more entertainment-based videos, as well as some political rants. And I will see you in the tree.